like your rhythm torrid, till it makes you mop your forehead. I've got swing for sale.
Have You Got Any Castles? 1938. 14 weird facts you didn't know. At first glance, Have You Got Any Castles looks like just a chaotic cartoon about books coming to life. But behind this colorful confusion, there's something much stranger. This 1938 short hides direct references to Hollywood stars, jokes that vanished from broadcast versions, cuts demanded after real deaths, and scenes considered too problematic for modern TV. Today, you're going to discover 14 bizarre facts that completely change how this cartoon should be seen. Fact 1. It wasn't about books, it was about cinema. Although the setting is a library, Have You Got Any Castles never truly intended to celebrate literature. Almost all the books that come to life in the short had already been turned into successful films just a few years earlier. The 1938 audience wasn't laughing at Jane Austen or Pearl Buck on paper, but at the Hollywood versions they already knew. Greta Garbo, Clark Gable, William Powell, Paul Muni, and Charles Laughton appear disguised as literary characters, functioning as animated cameo appearances. The cartoon, in practice, becomes a mirror of popular taste shaped by the very studio that produced it. Literature becomes a facade, cinema the true protagonist. This choice not only made the jokes instantly recognizable, but also reinforced the idea that books only gained value after passing through Hollywood. It was a subtle and arrogant way of asserting the dominance of sound cinema over other narrative arts. But this dependence on famous faces brought unexpected consequences, and not everyone felt comfortable being turned into a public caricature. Fact 2. They were disguised cameo appearances. For the 1938 audience, many characters weren't characters, they were recognizable stars. Have You Got Any Castles works almost like a secret parade of animated celebrities. William Powell appears as the Thin Man from The Thin Man. Clark Gable is multiplied in The House of the Seven Gables. Greta Garbo is mocked in So Big, and Paul Muni returns to the role that had earned him an Oscar as Louis Pasteur. These portrayals didn't require context because the audience already knew every face, voice, and mannerism. It was a kind of humor exclusive to those who regularly went to the movies. The joke wasn't in the book, but in the instant recognition of the star turned into a gag. The problem is that this visibility didn't come with formal consent. Many actors were never consulted, just caricatured and put on screen as cultural property. For some, it was publicity. For others, unwanted exposure. And this thin line between tribute and invasion would soon become a real problem for the studio. Fact 3. One character had to be erased by force. Among all the caricatures in the short, one caused real discomfort off screen. The town crier at the beginning is a direct caricature of Alexander Woollcott, an extremely influential theater critic and radio personality in the 1930s. Although he participated in the production after his death, Woollcott made it clear that he did not want to remain immortalized in that animated role. The request was eventually honored years later, and his scenes were removed from official reissues. This mutilated the original opening and even altered the ending of the cartoon in some versions. For decades, the public didn't even know those scenes had existed. Only later, DVD releases restored the cut material. This type of retroactive editing was uncommon at the time, but it revealed a growing fear among studios of dealing with image rights and posthumous reputations. What began as an inside joke ended up becoming a legal and symbolic problem, and this decision set a precedent for something even bigger: the removal of scenes considered too inappropriate for the future. Fact 4. It became problematic long before modern television. Long before today's discussions about representation, Have You Got Any Castles was already seen as delicate material within Warner itself. Several scenes use racial caricatures and cultural stereotypes common in the 1930s, but which quickly became uncomfortable in later decades. Characters inspired by Uncle Tom, Native peoples, Oriental figures, and African caricatures came to be treated as a risk for public broadcast. Because of this, the short almost never entered regular rotation on American TV after the 1950s. When it did appear, it came severely cut, fragmented, or shown out of context. The problem wasn't just the content itself, but the casual tone with which these stereotypes were used as visual gags. Unlike other cartoons of the time, here they are integrated into the main flow, making it impossible to remove them without breaking the entire structure. This turned the short into a kind of cultural ghost, known by collectors, avoided by broadcasters, and rarely seen in its original form. And curiously, that didn't stop some of these scenes from almost being aired again years later. Fact 5. It dangerously flirted with the censored 11. One of the most controversial parts of the short involves material that was already delicate even for Warner. The musical scene led by a charismatic band leader didn't originate there. It was reused from another cartoon that ended up on the famous list known as the Censored 11. By recycling the segment, the studio believed that diluted among dozens of fast gags, the content would go unnoticed. It worked for a while. In the 1990s, occasional broadcasts almost put that material on the air again, something extremely rare for any fragment associated with that list. This made Have You Got Any Castles a strange case, technically outside the ban, but carrying scenes with the same problematic DNA. For collectors, this became an attraction. For broadcasters, a legal nightmare. One wrong cut was enough to generate complaints and pull the short from circulation for years. This situation exposed how the studio dealt with its own past, trying to hide, reuse, and push problems forward. And this improvised strategy didn't stop there, because market decisions would make things even worse. Fact 6. Frank Tashlin wasn't telling a story. Unlike many Merry Melodies cartoons, Have You Got Any Castles doesn't care about building a beginning, middle, and end. Frank Tashlin structured the short as a continuous explosion of gags, references, and noise, betting on excess instead of narrative. Each new joke appears before the previous one has time to breathe, creating a deliberate sense of loss of control. The goal wasn't to follow characters, but to bombard the viewer with recognizable stimuli. And this style already appeared in other works by Tashlin, but here it reaches an almost aggressive level. The climax doesn't resolve conflicts, it simply sweeps everything off the screen with wind, noise, and movement. This reinforces the idea that the cartoon doesn't want to be remembered for a story, but for an intense sensory experience. For audiences of the time, it was modern. For later viewers, it became tiring and confusing. Curiously, this lack of narrative made later cuts easier, since almost nothing seemed essential, but this calculated mess hit a specific figure functioning as a critical anchor within the chaos. Fact 7. Rip Van Winkle isn't the hero, he's the censor. While the cartoon appears to be gratuitous chaos, Rip Van Winkle functions as the true moral axis of the story. He doesn't join the parties, doesn't sing, doesn't dance. He sleeps, and everything that wakes this character becomes something to be silenced. Every gag interrupted by him carries a clear message. Excessive fun is bothersome when it gets out of control. His actions aren't innocent. He cuts, interrupts, attacks, and in the end, literally erases all the other characters to restore his own peace. Instead of resolving conflicts, Rip simply eliminates the noise. This posture turns him into a symbolic representation of conservative authority, uncomfortable with popular culture, loud music, and bodies in motion. Not by chance, he survives intact while everything else is swept off the screen. The cartoon ends not with reconciliation, but with forced silence. For many viewers at the time, this passed as a joke. Today, it reveals an uncomfortable subtext about cultural control and repression disguised as light humor, and this role of Erasure echoes directly in the soundtrack used to intensify the discomfort. Fact 8. The music was designed to exhaust, not enchant. The soundtrack of Have You Got Any Castles doesn't function as simple accompaniment, but as an active element of sensory wear. Carl Stalling layers music, speeds up rhythms, and switches themes without pause, creating a constant sense of urgency and discomfort. There is no real silence in the short, only variations in sound intensity. This choice amplifies the visual chaos and reinforces the idea of excess that runs through the entire cartoon. For the 1938 audience, this sounded modern and energetic. For later audiences, it became exhausting. The music doesn't guide emotions, it pressures the viewer. Curiously, this aggressive use of the soundtrack made later cuts easier, since removing scenes rarely affected a continuous melody. The sound could be patched, replaced, or restarted without major narrative consequences. This led to different versions circulating with altered or reconstructed tracks, often without notice. The result is that today, one rarely hears the original sound experience imagined by Stalling, and this sonic instability connects directly to the fact that the ending was never truly definitive. Fact 9. The ending depends on which version you saw. Contrary to what many imagine, Have You Got Any Castles never had a completely fixed ending over the years. Depending on the copy shown, the short ends with different music, abrupt cuts, or altered transitions. Some versions use the original late 1930s ending track, while others replace the music with arrangements reused from Merry Melodies of the 1940s and 1950s. These changes were were never announced to the public and, for decades, went unnoticed. The result is that entire generations hold conflicting memories of the same cartoon. For some, the ending feels abrupt. For others, overly festive. This wasn't an artistic reinterpretation, but practical patchwork done during re-releases and TV airings. When scenes were cut, the sound had to be adjusted in a hurry. This sonic confusion helps explain why the short still feels unstable today. There is no definitive version that shaped the collective memory, and this connects directly to the reissues that erased essential names and credits from the cartoon. Fact 10. The re-release erased people from history. When Have You Got Any Castles was re-released in the Blue Ribbon program in 1947, something essential disappeared: the original credits. The names of animators, writers, and artists involved were simply removed from the screen. This wasn't an isolated case, but here the impact was greater because the short depended heavily on authorial identity and creative timing. To the public, the work began to look like a generic studio product without individuals behind it. This practice helped reinforce the idea that the cartoons belonged only to the Warner brand, not to the people who created them. Decades later, researchers had to reconstruct these credits from internal documents and private collections. Many professionals had already died without public recognition for this work. The Blue Ribbon saved the cartoon from commercial obscurity, but at the cost of erasing its authorship. This historical cleaning contributed to the confusion surrounding versions, dates, and origins of the short, and it paved the way for an even bigger mistake, one that would change its legal fate forever. Fact 11. It became public domain by accident, not intention. Unlike what many collectors imagine, Have You Got Any Castles didn't enter the public domain by strategy or a generous act by the studio. What happened was much simpler and more embarrassing. In the 1960s, the rights needed to be renewed after the legal 28-year term, but this was never done. The legal representative at the time simply let the registration expire. As a result, the short automatically entered the public domain in 1966. This failure opened the doors to low-quality copies, incomplete versions, and aggressive distribution on cheap tapes and unofficial broadcasts. The lack of control further fragmented the work, since any version could circulate as if it were definitive. The cartoon stopped belonging to a studio and began to exist in pieces, depending on who showed it. Ironically, this negligence ensured its survival, but sacrificed proper preservation. And this helps explain why so many people never saw the same Have You Got Any Castles twice. Fact 12. The incomplete version became the remembered version. For most of the public, Have You Got Any Castles was never seen as originally conceived. For decades, the circulating copies were alternate cuts, versions mutilated for television, or transfers made from already incomplete materials. This shaped collective memory in a distorted way. Many viewers grew up believing that certain scenes never existed, when in fact they had been removed for convenience or fear of controversy. This situation turned the short into something experimental by force. Each reappearance presented small differences, whether in length, music, or the sequence of gags. Unlike other classic cartoons, there was no dominant version to establish a cultural standard. The cartoon came to be remembered more for what was missing than for what it showed. For researchers and fans, reconstructing its original form became a constant puzzle. Ironically, the cuts meant to protect the audience ended up erasing the historical context of the cartoon itself, and this sets the stage for even more delicate discussions about scenes that today would be unthinkable. Fact 13. Many jokes today would be simply unthinkable. Even among cartoons from the same era, Have You Got Any Castles stands out for its casual use of stereotypes that today would provoke immediate revulsion. Visual jokes involving racialized characters, religious figures, and foreign cultures don't appear as criticism or satire, but as automatic humor inserted without question. The violence applied to these characters is often more direct, more humiliating, and presented as comedic normality. At the time, this reflected a market that didn't see these groups as an audience, but as targets. Watched today, the cartoon clearly exposes who was allowed to laugh and who existed only to be ridiculed. This discomfort is an essential part of its historical value, because it reveals how the industry operated without ethical restraints when it felt protected by laughter. Ignoring this aspect doesn't preserve the past, it only disguises it. Have You Got Any Castles doesn't just challenge modern sensitivities, it forces the viewer to confront the moral limits of the era that produced it, and that makes the final fact even more necessary. Fact 14. It was never a sincere tribute to books. Despite the library setting and the parade of famous covers, Have You Got Any Castles never treated literature as the protagonist. The books function only as visual triggers for jokes, recognizable faces, and loud musical numbers. The true star of the short is the film industry itself, showing off its power to turn any work into disposable spectacle. No story is respected, no narrative is deepened. Everything becomes raw material for fast consumption. This wasn't creative carelessness, but a direct reflection of a system that measured cultural value by momentary popularity. The short ends up being less about literary characters and more about the ego of cinema celebrating itself inside a space traditionally associated with silence and knowledge. This contradiction explains why the cartoon has aged with so much friction. It doesn't ask for nostalgic reverence, it demands critical analysis. Have You Got Any Castles survives not because it is comfortable, but because it exposes, without filters, how Hollywood viewed art, culture, and control. An uncomfortable but honestly revealing portrait. Have You Got Any Castles is not just an old cartoon full of chaos. It is a raw record of how Hollywood viewed culture, power, and control in the late 1930s. Between cuts, censorship, vanity, and legal neglect, the short survives fragmented but revealing. Watching it today is not comfortable nostalgia. It is facing a past that preferred to laugh, erase, and move on without looking back.